Two things came together for me wow, did you see that? This is either going to be really good or really terrible. Or just sit down, Dave. Don't say it. Okay, so the first thing that came together for me this week was just the news from the United Kingdom that the government there appointed a new government minister, a minister for loneliness. Now, not surprisingly, some people immediately made fun of this move by the British government, but the Prime Minister, Theresa May, said something quite important this week. She said that the challenge of loneliness in the United Kingdom is such a massive public health crisis that it requires a minister to address it. I want to confront this challenge for our society and for all of us to take action to address the loneliness endured by the elderly in particular and by carers, by those who have lost loved ones, people who have no one to talk to or share their thoughts and experiences with. The second resources that intersected with this news for me this week is a book I just finished called Wolf Boys by Dan Slater. This is a book about two young guys in Laredo, Texas, one who becomes a drug runner for the Zetas, the incredibly violent offshoot of the Gulf Cartel, and another teen from Laredo ends up becoming a police officer, first working for the DEA and then becoming a police officer in Laredo. And you would think that that would be a story about how one life was ruined by staying on one side of the tracks and the other found glory or at least some stability by staying on the other. But the story is really about two lives that were ruined by the war on drugs. The police officer never found any happiness in his job. He only stayed doing his job because it offered him an income, and he couldn't find anything else that was suitable for his skills. His hair came out in patches, his family life was terrible, he became estranged from his children. The war on drugs didn't make anyone happy, no matter what side of the fence they were on. So the intersection is, at least initially, loneliness and drugs. I've thought a lot lately about loneliness and drugs. On one hand, we are frequently lonely, of course, for a variety of reasons. In our society, when we need connection, what we actually have is a parody of connection. Work relationships that don't actually exist outside of work, friends we only see electronically, or because connection feels everywhere, we shut ourselves in our homes, or because we can't get out of our homes, the world never seems to come to us. We are so lonely that the UK government regards it as a public health crisis, and on our side of the Atlantic, the narrative of drug abuse, of overdosing, of families ruined by death and trauma from addiction is rampant. I would like to ask you, if you could please, to raise your hand. How many of us have been at some point personally ruined by addiction, or have had someone in our family pull us into their vortex of addiction, or know someone who has died because of addiction, or not known what to do because of someone's addiction, or broken off contact with someone because of an addiction? Can you raise your hand? Most of us. I'm going to talk about the intersection of loneliness and addiction and also resurrection today. First of all, addiction is complicated, and in no way do I want to suggest that if we simply surround an addict with company or new friends or better friends, that the addict will suddenly get better. If there were simple answers, we would have found them and moved on as a society. I speak imperfectly, leaving many holes and questions unanswered. I also know that if there are approximately 24 million Americans who are dependent on alcohol or drugs, that's 24 million stories that have to be told in context, and 24 million people who can prove to be exceptions rather than the rule. These themes intersect with a reading today from the Gospel of Mark about a man. Our reading says that this man is with an unclean spirit. No doubt our translators look at the Greek and understand that it doesn't make any sense to translate it how it actually says it literally. We see a man with an unclean spirit, but the text in the Greek actually says a man in an unclean spirit. And we might think, well, that's ridiculous. How could a man be in an unclean spirit? But that's the lesson of the language here. The Spirit has taken such control of the man that we know that there's a man in there somewhere. His true nature, whatever that might be, is in there somewhere, but he has become obliterated by the Spirit. He's not himself anymore, to the point where his friends or family might say, I feel like the person I used to know isn't here anymore. Or, I thought I knew you. I know that on the one hand, it's ridiculous, of course, this dialogue between Jesus and the Spirit. We know who you are. Have you come to destroy us? It sounds like it's been ripped straight from Ghostbusters or The Exorcist. This isn't the way that we talk. It certainly isn't the way that we understand and talk about health problems. We know who you are. Have you come to destroy us? But turn that into the force or the power or the demon that rages within some of us. Most addicts and alcoholics I've met articulate this fully. An alcoholic or an addict will know the line of questioning that goes something like this. Why is it that I want to go into a room and lock the door to be all alone with the very thing that is trying to kill me? How can I push my family to the side or run away from my friends who are trying to help me and go into a room and dance with the devil? Some of you no doubt read the astonishing and heartbreaking story of an opioid addict in New Hampshire in the New York Times last weekend, which chronicled the journey of a family who were at their wits' end working with their son or brother who overdosed 4 times in 6 hours. He was found blue-lipped and on his way out, revived, hospitalized. Within 90 minutes, he was out the door, drugging again, overdosed again, and so on. He overdosed 4 times in 6 hours. What is your interpretation of such a narrative? I obviously can't know for sure how Jesus would have interpreted such a story. He surely would have had great sympathy for this young man's family who were pulled into this vortex and forced to live this destructive, awful journey with him. Would Jesus know the pain of the families who try and try and try again to help their sons and daughters, their mothers and fathers and friends? I do know that Jesus differentiates the man from the spirit. Jesus doesn't come to destroy the man who is wreaking havoc in his community, only the spirit that inhabits him. The person is not the same thing as their cage. People are not their cage. In the 1980s, a number of experiments related to drug use were conducted that put a rat in a cage with 2 bottles of water, 1 bottle with just water and 1 bottle of water that was laced with heroin. The point was, heroin is addictive. How addictive is it? If you put a rat in a cage with a bottle of water with heroin in it, after a little while, the rat will continue to drink from the bottle that has heroin in it over and over and over again. This stuff is awful for you. Yes, it is. But Dr. Bruce Alexander, a Canadian scientist, decided that the experiment was flawed. If the rat's only choice when by itself is do drugs or not do drugs, what would it do when it has nothing else to do? If its life were completely devoid of other social stimuli, then yes, it will seek out the drugs. But rats are social animals like humans are. Alexander ran the experiment, but in a different way. He created Rat Park, with lots of rats living in it, with lots of things to do, wheels and tunnels and places to lie down to take naps, and cheese, lots of cheese. I don't know if there was any cheese, but it seems like Rat Park would have a lot of cheese. And lots of rats lived there with space to run and to roam. 2 kinds of water available to them, water and water with heroin. And in Rat Park, all the rats obviously tried both water bottles because they didn't know what was in them. But the rats with good, happy, healthy socialization in Rat Park did not like the drugged water. After a little while, they mostly shunned it, consuming less than 1/4 of the drugs the isolated rats used, and none of them died. Is there a lesson there? What we need in life as much as anything is connection, but what we are so frequently offered is simply a parody of connection. What is also clear about what we need, of course, is connection to something, anything. And when human beings don't bond to or with human beings in happy, healthy socialization, they will still bond to something. You and I will always bond to something. That's why the old rat experiments were so flawed. Look what happens when you leave a rat alone with heroin. It will become addicted. Man, this stuff is dangerous. Of course it is. And some drugs are more addictive than others. Of course they are. But many of those rats, they took the drugs in Rat Park, developed a twitch, a habit, a craving, but most were able in community to eventually shun that thing, the evil spirit that wanted to kill them. The center point of this text in the Gospel of Mark is the Spirit saying to Jesus, I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Everything falls around that proclamation from the Spirit. I know who you are. And that statement set within our culture can be really toxic. Because we hear that line and we hear a conquering individual in the manifestation of Jesus Christ who has the willpower or the skill to teach with authority and demand that the Spirit leave this poor man alone. We know that Christian means to be a little Christ, an imitator, one who follows in the steps of Jesus. But in the context in which we're reading this today, we might imagine Christ the victor with his foot on the throat of a evil spirit or a stupid demon, and in our own way, wonder about that guy in New Hampshire. Why can't he just be stronger? Why can't any addict just get some strength and do this thing? The Western Church has re-emphasized this idea of Jesus as the one with infinite willpower by portraying him as alone on the cross, alone in the tomb, alone when he greets the disciples, alone in the ascension. In other words, our Western way of looking at Christ is the same way we look at an addict or an alcoholic or anybody struggling. Get on your horse and ride it, man. Come on. Pull yourself up. But if there's any cause in particular for addiction making itself manifest, or a way of describing the spiral downward that results from addiction, it is isolation. Perhaps a person doesn't feel isolated when they start using, but they will ultimately feel more lonely than anyone else on the planet when they continue. The addiction causes loneliness, and loneliness feeds the addiction in a spiral towards Hades, the place of death. The miracle, of course, is that as you continue to spiral towards Hades, is that Christ is waiting for you when you get there. Could you put the picture up on the screen? It's the same one that's on the front of your bulletins this morning. The Eastern Church tries to affirm that you may sense that Christ is waiting for you in Hades in this life or the next. Christ is waiting for you in crucifixion and in resurrection and in eternity. In the Eastern Church, Jesus is, in fact, always conquering death with others. I found this image in the Christian Century this week in an article by John Dominic Crossan, who came upon this in a fresco in an old Byzantine church. He was startled by it because of this depiction of Jesus. Jesus is striding forcefully to the viewer's right, but looks backward as his right hand firmly grips the right wrist of a white-haired, white-bearded man. And who is that man that he is grasping? It is Adam, symbolic of all of humanity. And behind Adam is Eve. And both Adam and Eve are being wrenched from a sepulchre. Behind them, the viewer glimpses the tops of 6 other heads which belong to the prophets. And to the right are 2 figures who are David and Solomon. Christ is emerging from a dark, semicircular area below the ground, and he is standing atop and trampling down a prostrate figure whose feet and hands are chained. This figure looks up with frightened eyes at Christ, whose long cross seems to hold down his head. This is Hades, personification of death. He is also the gatekeeper of Hades, the prison house of death. And to his right are scattered locks, bolts, and bars, which are flattened on the ground, arranged in cruciform pattern. This is not hell, this is Hades. In terms of personification, this is not Satan, the opponent of God, but Hades, the custodian of the dead. This resurrection image of the East depicts the crucified Christ breaking forcibly into Hades, tossing aside bolts and locks, forming its gates into a cross, chaining the Hades persona, and liberating all of humanity as personified in Adam and Eve from the prison of death. This, the Eastern Church proclaims, Jesus does in a weekend, and always will, with others, never alone. What God wills is life. What God wills is freedom, and certainly freedom from chemical abuse and addiction. But what God also wills, and the Eastern Church portrays so much better than the Western Church, is that we tackle life's problems in community. Is it a coincidence that it seems like opioid addiction is exploding in our country in the same era that this, our parody of connection, is so pervasive? The biggest misconception in any addict's mind is that they are alone, that they are the only one who feels so alone, that she is the only one who has ever had this kind of pain, that he is the only person to have ever had this much doubt. And the evil spirit, the cage that comes to dominate life, says over and over and over again, yes, you are the only one. You are so alone that you take me, you use me, you abuse me. But the reality is that you are not your cage. And the one you love is not their cage. And your colleague or your friend is not their cage. And your parent who is struggling is not their cage. Your brother or your sister is not their cage. And just down the street in almost every town and in every city in America, meanwhile, someone is trying to get help. Someone is going to a meeting with other addicts or alcoholics for the first time or the 10,000th time, and someone is getting a chip for their anniversary and realizing that the miracle was that they were never alone. They just had to take the first step. They just had to have the moment of clarity. They just had to realize that the love and help and support were there, whether it was from family or within community. Miracles are happening every single day in America. Miracles are happening every single day because we come to understand that Christ is not crucified alone, because Christ never died alone. Christ was never alone, and neither are we. Miracles are happening every single day in America, but they don't happen when people are alone. May God's peace be with you this day. Let us pray. Holy and gracious God, in your infinite wisdom and creativity, you give us life. In this day and age, we walk through this life, getting really good at becoming cynical, believing that miracles are almost passé. They don't happen anymore. New life can't be found. Yet each and every day, miracles are happening all around us. As people awaken to the fact that their greatest call and their greatest treasure is to become bonded, not with a drug, not with a substance, but with their loved ones and with you. Bless us, we pray. as we acknowledge, recognize, and believe that we are not alone, have never been alone, and never will be alone. Bless us, we pray, as we seek a miracle for our nation. People of God, let us now arise and greet one another with a sign of peace, a hand on the heart, a touching of the elbow, a handshake, whatever is right and comfortable for you. And if you feel so comfortable, let the person next to you know today that they are not alone, that you are right here with them right now. May God's peace be with you.